The fluorescent lights in the executive boardroom hummed overhead, far too bright, casting a cold glare over the polished mahogany table. My palms rested flat against the surface, steady, though my chest was pounding so hard I could feel each beat echo in my ears. 20 years of my life had been given to this company. My nights, my weekends, my health. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. Richard Hale, our CEO, sat at the head of the table with that detached look he always wore when he was about to do something cruel but wanted to disguise it as business. He cleared his throat, adjusted his cufflinks, and his voice sliced through the silence. "Catherine," he said, deliberately, using my full name like I was a stranger, "your time here has come to an end. We're moving forward without you." The words landed like a hammer blow. My mouth went dry. My fingers trembled slightly, but I locked them down against the table. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. After all, I had been with HaleTech for 2 decades, building its core systems, mentoring every engineer who came through these doors. Surely he couldn't mean what I thought he meant. But then, he leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers together, and delivered the final cut. "You've done your part, but the industry is changing, and frankly, you're outdated. We need fresher talent, younger blood. It's time you step aside." My ears burned hot, and a metallic taste filled my mouth. I heard a muffled gasp from one of the board members down the table. A few avoided eye contact, staring at their notepads, as if they could vanish into the wood grain. No one spoke up for me. Not a single voice. 20 years reduced to this, a dismissal, dressed in corporate politeness, but laced with contempt. I wanted to scream, to demand how he could erase me so coldly, but I forced myself to breathe through the rage clawing at my chest. This was Richard Hale, at his most dangerous calm, collected and utterly ruthless. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile a butcher might give, before lowering the blade. "Of course we'll provide a severance package," he continued smoothly, like that was supposed to soften the blow. "But your role is redundant and effective. Today, you're relieved of all responsibilities." He glanced to the HR director beside him, who shifted nervously, clutching a folder thick with papers, my termination packet. The room spun slightly. 20 years of designs, patents, late nights, and breakthroughs flashed before me like a cruel montage. Every line of code I had written, every system I had architected, every product they had sold under my name, all of it, suddenly twisted into nothing more than a footnote. I thought of the countless times Richard had smiled on stage, basking in the glow of applause, while the algorithms powering our success had been mine. And now, he was discarding me, as if I were nothing more than an old machine ready to be replaced. My throat tightened, but I refused to let him see me break. The silence stretched heavy, suffocating. My eyes met his, and for a flicker of a second, I saw the cold satisfaction there. He believed he had won, that he had cut me down at last, neatly, efficiently. He had no idea. I pressed my nails into my palm, grounding myself. Yes, he had just fired me. Yes, 20 years had been thrown back in my face. But what Richard Hale didn't know, what none of them in that room knew, was that I had been preparing for this exact moment. In the days leading up to that fateful meeting, I had allowed myself to believe I was indispensable. It wasn't arrogance, it was simple arithmetic. Who else knew the architecture of our flagship platform the way I did? Who else had been there from the beginning, when HaleTech was nothing more than a rented office with peeling paint and 6 people working off folding chairs. I remembered those early days with a strange tenderness. Back then, we were all equals bound together by ambition and late-night pizza scribbling algorithms on whiteboards until our markers dried out. I had believed we were a family, naive as that sounds now. Richard Hale was different then too, or at least I thought he was. He shook my hand when I joined his grip, firm, his smile wide. He promised, "Stick with us, Catherine. We're going to change the world together." And I did stick with them. I stayed through the failures, through the sleepless product launches, through the endless revisions. I built frameworks no one else could maintain, solved bugs no one else could even diagnose, and kept the company alive when venture capital nearly pulled the plug. When our first big contract came through, I was the one who wrote the prototype overnight. Richard was the one who presented it on stage the next morning, claiming it as the fruit of his leadership. I watched from the crowd, exhausted, but proud, waiting for him to acknowledge me. He didn't. Not then, not ever. That was the beginning of the pattern, his voice booming across auditoriums, my work embedded invisibly behind him. Year after year, I convinced myself it didn't matter, that recognition wasn't why I did this work. But recognition does matter more than I wanted to admit. Each promotion that passed me by burned deeper. I trained younger men who leapfrogged me within a year, praised as visionaries for ideas I had seeded in late-night brainstorming sessions. They called me reliable, steady, supportive words that sound flattering until you realize they are code for invisible. There was one meeting that still haunts me. I had just presented a new optimization model that cut processing time in half. The room buzzed with excitement, executives whispering about the cost savings. Richard leaned forward, clasped his hands, and said, "Brilliant, Greg. This could be a game changer." Greg was one of the junior engineers I had mentored, barely out of college, his only contribution having been fetching me coffee that week. He looked as stunned as I felt, but Richard's words stuck. From that moment on, Greg's career skyrocketed while I stayed in the same chair. It wasn't just oversight, it was theft, plain and simple. I swallowed the insult because I told myself the company needed me. And maybe foolishly, I needed them too. Hale Tech had become my second home. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, even my sister's wedding, because a deadline loomed. I sacrificed so much, believing loyalty would be rewarded. Instead, loyalty made me a target. By the time I turned 45, whispers began around me. She's reliable, but maybe she's too set in her ways. Younger hires, bright-eyed and eager, were paraded into meetings, while I was left maintaining the systems that kept the company running. I became the backbone nobody acknowledged until Richard decided the spine was no longer fashionable. That was the false calm before the storm. Outwardly, life at Hale Tech ticked on, but underneath, cracks were spreading. I had given my blood, sweat, and years, and Richard had filed all of it under expendable. He thought he was preparing to replace me. What he didn't know was that I had been preparing too. The night before the boardroom ambush, I was at my desk long past sunset. The office had thinned out hours earlier, the younger engineers rushing home to whatever lives they had outside these walls, while I sat surrounded by the glow of 3 monitors. Lines of code scrolled endlessly, familiar as scripture. I had always loved these late hours, when the building grew quiet and the hum of servers felt like a heartbeat. I could understand. But that night, something changed. My inbox pinged with a new message, urgent, flagged, not meant for me. The subject line read, "Final strategy before IPO." At first, I thought it was another one of those broad company blasts. I opened it without hesitation, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't meant for me at all. The email thread stretched like a noose around my neck. Richard's name topped the chain, his words as cold as his boardroom tone. "We need to move Catherine Monroe out before the quarter closes. She's redundant. The patent filings are in our name. She doesn't realize the product launch is already prepped without her. Once she's gone, we can proceed cleanly. No loose ends." I read the lines again, my eyes blurring. He had already planned it. My termination wasn't a matter of performance or industry shifts. It was a calculated execution. And worse, he believed he owned my life's work. I scrolled further down the thread, my stomach tightening with every reply. The CFO chimed in, "Agree. Push her out with a severance. Make it quiet." Another executive, "We'll spin it as restructuring. Investors won't blink." HR's response was chilling. "Termination packet ready. Waiting for your green light." But it was Richard's final message that shattered any illusion I still clung to. Erase her contributions. The algorithm is ours now. After the IPO, no one will even remember she existed. The words burned into me. Erase me. After 2 decades of building their empire, they wanted to scrub me from history, like a mistake on a whiteboard. I sat frozen, the cursor blinking in cruel rhythm at the bottom of the email. The anger rose slowly, hot and acidic, until my hands trembled on the keyboard. For 20 years, I had sacrificed my health, my family, my sense of self for a company that now plotted to cut me out like dead weight. But underneath the fury was something sharper, steadier. Resolve. Because Richard Hale was wrong. I wasn't naive. I wasn't blind. And I wasn't unprepared. What Richard and his pack of yes-men didn't know was that while they had been scheming behind closed doors, I had been quietly building my own defense. I had filed the core patent 3 years ago, under my own name, not the company's, through a shell LLC I created. Every line of critical code was documented, time-stamped, notarized. My attorney, Laura Jennings, had reviewed the filings so thoroughly she could recite clause numbers by heart. I had learned long ago that Richard took credit for what wasn't his, so I prepared, patiently, secretly. And now staring at this accidental glimpse into their plot, I realized the timing was perfect. He thought he was pulling the strings lining up my dismissal like some neat corporate maneuver. But the strings were in my hands all along. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors washing my face in pale light. For the first time in years, I smiled, not the weary, polite smile I gave in meetings, but something harder edged with steel. Richard Hale wanted to erase me. He had no idea that by pushing me out, he had triggered the very trap I'd been setting. I printed the email thread, slid the pages into a folder I kept locked in my desk drawer. I shut down my monitors, gathered my bag, and walked out of HaleTech with the quiet knowledge that by tomorrow, everything would change. They thought they were about to destroy me. They had no idea I was about to destroy them first. As I drove home that night, with the incriminating email folder locked tight in my bag, memories clawed their way up sharp and relentless. They weren't gentle recollections of camaraderie or small victories. They were wounds I had tried to cauterize over the years, each one a reminder of how Richard Hale and his circle had chipped away at me piece by piece. I remembered the promotion I was promised 10 years ago. Director of Engineering, Richard had said, leaning against the doorframe of my office, his smile broad and practiced. "You've earned this, Catherine. HR will draft the paperwork." I had gone home that night and opened a bottle of wine, calling my sister to tell her the news. I even bought a new blazer for the announcement. But the paperwork never came. Weeks passed, and when I pressed HR, they stammered that the role had been restructured. 2 months later, Greg, the very junior I had mentored from scratch, was named director. Richard praised him in the company newsletter, citing his visionary leadership. Then there was the conference in Chicago, where my optimization model had just saved the company nearly $1 million a quarter in server costs. I wasn't invited to present. Instead, Richard strutted across the stage, talking about his breakthrough. I sat in the audience, my badge pressed to my chest, listening, as strangers applauded him for work that had drained my nights and nearly ruined my health. I still remember the slow clap of his hands when he returned backstage, glancing at me like I should be grateful to have been in the room at all. And the equity, God, the equity. In year 12, when Hailtech was clawing its way towards stability, Richard gathered the leadership team. "Everyone who's been here more than a decade deserves skin in the game," he said, passing out envelopes with stock certificates. I received one too, my hands trembling with pride. But weeks later, I discovered mine wasn't real equity. It was phantom stock, a fancy term for nothing. No ownership, no voice, no share in the wealth I had helped create. I confronted him once, cornering him outside the glass elevators. "Why was mine different?" I asked. His eyes narrowed, and he replied with that maddeningly calm tone. "You're stable, Catherine. You're not the type to chase risk. This protects you, protects me," as if he had done me a favor while robbing me blind. The indignities piled higher as the years went on. HR suggesting mentorship roles instead of advancement. Younger hires snickering behind my back, parroting Richard's casual remarks. "She's solid, but not leadership material." Even friends who once shared my late-night grind slowly drifted away, chasing promotions or flattering Richard for crumbs of recognition. I had swallowed every insult, every theft of credit, because I told myself I loved the work. And I did. The code, the design, the challenge, they were mine in a way no one could take. But Richard hadn't just stolen my ideas. He had stolen years of my life, siphoning loyalty while labeling me obsolete. Driving through the empty streets that night, I gripped the wheel tighter. The anger that had simmered in me for years finally boiled. This wasn't just about a stolen promotion or a conference snub. This was about erasure. Richard wanted me gone. My name wiped from history, my fingerprints scrubbed from the very algorithms that had made Hailtech what it was. But as those memories cut through me, something else rose to the surface clarity. The betrayal wasn't new. It had been happening for 2 decades. The difference now was that I had proof. I had leverage. And this time, I wasn't going to swallow it. This time, I was going to use it. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the engine, and sat in silence for a long moment. The suburban night was quiet. No hum of servers. No fluorescent buzz. Just me, my heartbeat, and the knowledge that everything Richard had done to bury me had only sharpened my resolve. He thought he had finally broken me. He didn't realize he had forged me instead. People often assume betrayal blindsides you, that it comes out of nowhere like a knife in the dark. But for me, Richard's knife had been hovering at my throat for years. I had learned to anticipate it, to watch the way his eyes lingered too long on my designs, the way his smile widened when investors praised his innovations. I knew one day he would try to cut me out completely. And because I knew I prepared, it started small, almost invisible. I began keeping meticulous records of every line of critical code I authored. Not just Git commits that could be overwritten or buried under company repositories, but notarized timestamps through independent systems. Each submission logged under my personal name, each draft archived in a place no one at Hailtech could touch. At first, it was an insurance policy, a way to soothe myself when Richard strutted across stages stealing my thunder. But as the years went on, the archive became something more. It became a weapon. 3 years ago, when Hailtech flirted with a buyout by a larger competitor, I realized the stakes were rising. I spent long nights reading up on intellectual property law, my laptop glowing in my darkened living room. The legal jargon felt foreign at first, but then, like code, it began to make sense. Ownership wasn't about who shouted the loudest in a boardroom. It was about who filed first, who documented best, who held the paper trail. And that could be me. So I created a limited liability company, Monroe Innovations, LLC, quietly, discreetly. I filed the paperwork on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day no one would remember. Under that company, I registered patents for the algorithmic engine I had built, the one Richard had been passing off as his brainchild. I remember the clerk's stamp, the heavy thunk, as the patent application became official. It was the sound of my freedom. Of course, I wasn't naive enough to trust only myself. That's when I found Laura Jennings. Laura was a lawyer with a reputation for being relentless in court and absolutely unflinching with corporate bullies. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, with a voice that carried the weight of authority. I met her at a small cafe, sliding a folder across the table with shaking hands. Inside were drafts of my code-dated submissions and my half-complete patent filings. She flipped through them, her brow furrowed, then looked up at me. "You've been smart," she said simply. "Smarter than most engineers who come to me when it's already too late. You're not crazy, Catherine. You're right, they're setting you up. But you've already built your defense." From that day forward, Laura became my silent partner. Every email Richard sent, praising someone else for my work, I archived. Every draft of a new model, I filed through Monroe Innovations. Every time I stepped into a boardroom and heard my ideas reframed by another man's voice, I reminded myself, it doesn't matter what they say here. The law will say otherwise. I lived 2 lives. The dutiful employee who smiled and nodded in meetings, and the quiet strategist who prepared for the day the axe would fall. It was exhausting, yes, but it gave me a strange kind of peace. Each time Richard brushed past me, like I was invisible, I thought, keep underestimating me. You're making this easier. And now, with that damning email in my possession, the final piece clicked into place. They thought they were preparing to erase me. They didn't realize I had already carved my name into the foundation of everything they planned to steal. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror that night, brushing my hair, staring at my reflection. 45 years old, lines at the corners of my eyes, tired from decades of battles fought in silence. But behind the weariness, I saw something else control. I wasn't the loyal employee waiting for scraps of recognition anymore. I was the architect of their empire, and I had the documents to prove it. When Richard Hale finally swung the blade, He'd find it cutting clean through his own ambitions, and I would be the one holding the handle. The boardroom was colder than usual that morning, though maybe it was only me who felt the chill. The blinds were drawn halfway, muting the autumn sun into slivers across the table. 12 executives sat in their polished leather chairs, murmuring in low voices, sipping their coffee from identical porcelain cups. I entered quietly, folder in hand, my face unreadable. I could feel their eyes on me, curious, uneasy, like they all knew something was about to happen, but didn't want to be the first to acknowledge it. Richard Hale was already at the head of the table, his silver hair slicked back his tie, perfectly knotted. He rose as I walked in, not out of respect, but to command attention. "Let's begin," he said, his tone clipped, confident, rehearsed. He didn't even bother waiting for everyone to settle. Effective immediately, Richard announced, Catherine Monroe will be stepping down from her role at HaleTech. He let the words hang in the air, heavy final. A ripple moved through the room, some startled glances, some feigned indifference. The HR director slid a thick envelope across the table toward me. Termination packet. My name printed in bold. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, as if I were listening to a routine update. My heart was steady. He expected outrage. He expected protest. He expected me to beg. But I gave him nothing. Richard smiled, mistaking my composure for defeat. Catherine has been with us for 20 years. He continued, his voice dripping with false warmth. We thank her for her service, but as you all know, the industry is evolving. Innovation requires fresh perspectives. Sometimes hard choices must be made. Fresh perspectives, hard choices. He made it sound noble, like he was a visionary leading the company into the future, rather than a thief cutting loose the person who had built the very system his empire depended on. One board member cleared his throat. Richard, are we certain this is the right timing? Catherine's team. Richard cut him off with a flick of his hand. The transition is already in motion. Her responsibilities will be absorbed. Investors will see this as streamlining. He looked back at me, then his eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. We wish her well in her future endeavors. The words stung, not because they surprised me, but because they were so rehearsed, so casually cruel. 20 years reduced to a line fit for a press release. I felt a flicker of pity for the men and women at that table, too afraid to intervene, too complicit to stand up. I leaned forward slightly, catching Richard's gaze. For the first time all morning, his smile faltered. I didn't speak, not yet, but my silence was louder than any protest could have been. I let him savor his victory, let him believe he had won, let him think I had nothing left but shock and resignation. Inside, though, I was already counting down the minutes. Laura Jennings was waiting with the paperwork. My patents, my LLC, my documented trail of ownership, all lined up like dominoes, ready to fall. Richard straightened his jacket, satisfied. Meeting adjourned, he said, already turning toward his assistant. The others shuffled to their feet, avoiding my eyes, eager to escape the tension. I rose slowly, tucking the unopened envelope under my arm. As I walked toward the door, the room buzzed again with whispers. Richard thought they were whispers about my failure. He didn't realize they would soon be whispers about his downfall. The boardroom door clicked shut behind me. My heels struck the marble floor of the hallway, each step measured, deliberate. I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking toward the beginning of the end, for Richard Hale, for HaleTech, for the empire they had built on my silence. and the silence was about to break. I didn't go home after leaving that boardroom. I didn't sit in my car and cry or pace my kitchen or drown myself in wine, like Richard probably assumed I would. Instead, I took the elevator down to the lobby, the termination packet still sealed under my arm, and walked straight out into the crisp October air. The city hummed around me, horns, blaring people, rushing past with lattes and phones pressed to their ears, but for the first time in years, I felt strangely calm. My phone buzzed. It was Laura Jennings. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "He thinks he won," Laura chuckled softly. "Then it's time." I met her 2 blocks away at a quiet cafe with brass-rimmed windows and the smell of burnt espresso hanging in the air. She was already seated with her laptop, open paper spread across the table. Her eyes met mine, sharp and unwavering. "The cease and desist is ready. We'll file with the federal court in the morning, but Richard will get his copy before he finishes lunch." I slid the unopened envelope, the termination packet, onto the table between us. "Let him believe I walked away empty-handed," I said. "It'll make the fall harder." Laura nodded. "You understand this isn't just about your job, Catherine. This is about their entire product line. If they launch with your code, they'll be violating federal patent law. The damages alone could cripple Hailtech." I leaned back in my chair, letting the truth settle. "Good," I whispered. By noon, Richard's assistant burst into his office, carrying the thick envelope Laura had couriered over. Inside was the cease and desist letter, stamped and signed with my name printed boldly on the patent registrations. Every clause, every filing date, every piece of documentation was lined up in black and white. It wasn't just a letter, it was a mirror held up to his theft. Later I would hear from someone inside the building how Richard reacted. He ripped off his glasses, slammed the letter onto the conference table, and barked, "Impossible. This can't be real." But it was. The patent belonged to me. Monroe Innovations, LLC was registered in my name. The algorithm he had paraded in front of investors as his crown jewel was legally mine. One board member, braver than most, reportedly asked Richard, "Did you know she filed these?" Silence followed. Richard's jaw clenched, his face flushed a violent red. He muttered something about oversight and miscommunication, but the damage was done. I imagined him pacing his glass-walled office, staring out at the skyline he thought he owned, realizing in real time that the foundation of his empire had shifted beneath him. For once, Richard Hale was not in control. Back at the cafe, Laura raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "Congratulations," she said. "You've just declared war." I sipped my tea, the steam curling up between us. War. That was exactly what it was. But unlike Richard, I hadn't walked into this blind. I had spent years preparing my arsenal, documenting my every move, filing my protections in silence, while he preened on stages. The first ripple hit that afternoon. Hailtech's legal team scrambled, calling emergency meetings, drafting panicked responses. But Laura had already filed the paperwork federally. The news would be public soon. Investors would see the truth. The algorithm wasn't theirs to sell. By evening, my phone lit up with messages from former colleagues. "What's going on?" one asked. "Richard looks like he's seen a ghost." Another wrote, "Did you really file the patent yourself?" I didn't answer. Let the whispers spread. Let the story grow. I walked home under the city lights, the autumn wind tugging at my coat. Richard had thought my silence in that boardroom meant defeat. He hadn't realized it was strategy. Silence is not surrender. Silence is the sound of a trap about to snap shut, and Richard Hale had just stepped straight into it. The first headline hit less than 48 hours later. I woke to my phone buzzing relentlessly, a dozen notifications stacked across the screen. The financial press had gotten hold of Laura's filings, and they were splashed across every business site in bold type: Hailtech's flagship product, under patent dispute, core algorithm, belongs to former employee. My name was there printed in black and white. For the first time in decades, Catherine Monroe, patent holder. I stared at it for a long moment, the words soaking in like sunlight after a long winter. They hadn't erased me. They couldn't. By mid-morning, Hailtech's stock plummeted. Investors panicked, dumping shares in droves, while analysts debated on live television whether the company could survive an injunction. I turned on the TV just long enough to hear one commentator say, "If these allegations hold up, Hailtech could be liable for damages exceeding $90 million. Their entire IPO strategy may collapse." I switched it off. I didn't need the noise. Meanwhile, inside Hailtech, chaos reigned. A friend from accounting texted me in a flurry of exclamation points. "Richard's losing it. He's screaming in the halls. Half the board is calling emergency sessions." Another, a junior engineer I had once mentored, messaged quietly, "If you need statements, I'll back you. Everyone knows it was your work." But it wasn't just employees whispering now. The story had legs. Journalists dug through old press releases, pointing out how often Richard's speeches had shifted language suspiciously close to my documented patents. Tech bloggers pulled up screenshots of presentations where my code snippets' watermarks intact had been displayed without attribution. Each revelation was a nail driven deeper into Hailtech's coffin. On social media, the tide turned vicious. Hashtags trended, #justice for Catherine, Hailtech, scandal, our stolen code. Former employees chimed in, recounting stories of my late-night work, of Richard brushing me aside, of the way men in the company had been elevated, while I stayed invisible. What I had endured quietly for years was now laid bare in public. And Richard? He did what cornered men always do. He tried to spin. He held a press conference, jaw tight, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the patents had been misfiled, that I had misinterpreted ownership. He tried to frame me as bitter, a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. But when reporters asked why the patent filings clearly bore my name, why Monroe Innovations LLC had been registered years before the supposed misfile, Richard's mask cracked. Cameras caught the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the beads of sweat along his temple. The footage went viral before the conference was even over. That night, I walked past Hailtech's gleaming glass headquarters, the lobby lights burning like interrogation lamps. Crowds of reporters clustered outside, shouting questions as executives slipped through side doors, heads down. Richard's empire, once untouchable, now looked fragile, brittle, ready to shatter. Inside, they scrambled to reassure investors, to craft new press releases, to beg employees to stay. But panic had a scent, and it filled every corridor. Engineers whispered about jumping ship. Department heads polished resumes. HR fielded resignations in droves. From my vantage point, I didn't need to lift a finger. The dominoes were falling on their own. Richard had always believed he could bury me under silence, that my absence would make the company stronger. But my presence, my name on those patents, was louder than he had ever imagined. And as the stock continued to dive, as analysts projected billion-dollar losses, as investors demanded answers Richard couldn't provide, one truth became undeniable. The company was collapsing under the weight of his arrogance. He had built an empire on stolen foundations, And now those foundations were cracking wide open. The courthouse smelled of varnished oak and old paper, a place where words carried the weight of law instead of ego. As I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Laura Jennings, my heart pounded, but not from fear. It was anticipation. 2 decades of betrayal had led to this moment. Across the aisle, Richard Hale adjusted his cufflinks, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. He looked older than I had ever seen him. The confidence stripped away his face, pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The judge entered, robes sweeping gavel striking order into the room. This case, she began, concerns allegations of intellectual property theft and misrepresentation. She glanced down at the documents before her. Ms. Monroe, through her LLC, claims legal ownership of the algorithm HaleTech, has presented as its flagship product. HaleTech disputes this claim. Her eyes lifted steady, impartial. We will proceed. Laura stood first, her voice clear, sharp as glass. Your Honor, this is not a case of misunderstanding. This is theft. For 20 years, my client built the systems that power HaleTech. She anticipated this very betrayal and filed her patent 3 years prior. We have documented proof of her ownership, notarized timestamps, and evidence of deliberate concealment by Mr. Hale and his executives. She walked to the projector, clicking to display Exhibit A, the patent filing under Monroe Innovations, LLC. My name filled the screen. The filing date glowed like a beacon, 3 years before HaleTech's IPO draft. Richard's lawyer rose, his voice oily, rehearsed. Your Honor, these filings were done under the company's purview. Ms. Monroe was a HaleTech employee. She had no independent right to file what was developed as part of her duties. Laura didn't flinch. Then, how do you explain this? She clicked again, pulling up the missent email thread. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Richard's own words filled the screen. Erase her contributions. The algorithm is ours now. After the IPO, no one will even remember she existed. The judge's eyes narrowed. Richard shifted in his seat, jaw tight. His lawyer stammered objections, but the words were already out there, damning and undeniable. Laura pressed on, each point a nail in the coffin. My client logged every code submission independently. We have notarized certifications. We have receipts of her LLC registration. And now we have evidence straight from Mr. Hale himself that he knew he was erasing her work, that he intended to profit from her silence. This is not company property, Your Honor. This is Catherine Monroe's intellectual property. I sat still, my hands folded, but inside I trembled with the force of it all. Years of invisibility, of watching Richard steal my light, were finally being reversed. My name was spoken in a courtroom not as an afterthought, but as the rightful owner. Richard's lawyer scrambled, arguing about corporate structure, about chain of command, but the judge held up a hand. Enough. The documents speak for themselves. Mr. Hale, did you or did you not send this email? Richard's throat worked as he swallowed. Taken out of context, he muttered. Answer the question, the judge pressed. His voice cracked, yes. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike. The judge leaned forward. This court finds that the patent belongs to Ms. Monroe. HaleTech is guilty of intellectual property infringement and attempted fraud. HaleTech is hereby ordered to pay damages in the amount of $95 million to Monroe Innovations, LLC. Furthermore, HaleTech is barred from releasing any product utilizing this algorithm without Ms. Monroe's express written consent. The gavel came down with a crack that reverberated through my bones. Richard's shoulders slumped, his empire crumbling, not with a bang, but with the sound of his own defeat echoing in the chamber. As the reporters rushed forward, scribbling notes, snapping photos, I remained seated, calm, steady. Laura leaned toward me, whispering, "It's over. You won." But I didn't smile. Not yet. Because for me, it wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine, about proving that silence does not mean weakness, that preparation is its own kind of power. Richard Hale had underestimated me for 20 years. And now, in front of the law, in front of the world, he had been forced to admit what he had always feared, that the empire wasn't his. It was mine. The courtroom emptied slowly, reporters clustering near the doors, their voices buzzing with questions I had no interest in answering. Cameras flashed as Richard slipped out a side exit, his face pale, his once commanding stride reduced to a hurried shuffle. For years he had walked with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. Now he looked like someone who had just realized the ground beneath him had given way. Laura touched my shoulder. "They'll want statements," she said softly. "The press investors, maybe even the tech journals. You don't have to say a word if you don't want to." And I didn't. For 20 years, I had been silenced in 1,000 ways. Talked over in meetings, passed over for promotions, erased from press releases. But this silence was mine. It wasn't forced on me. It was chosen. I walked past the cameras without stopping, my eyes fixed forward. The chill autumn air sharp in my lungs. Someone called my name. "Catherine, Catherine. How does it feel to win?" But I kept going. Because this wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. And the truth had already been carved into law. The days that followed were a blur of headlines. My name appeared in articles, podcasts, television segments. Commentators praised me as a symbol of resilience, a quiet genius who finally got her due. Former colleagues reached out, some with apologies, some with congratulations. Greg, the junior engineer, who had once been credited with my work, sent me a message that was little more than a confession. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop it. "I'm sorry." I read it, then set my phone down without replying. There was no anger left in me, just a hollow kind of clarity. Apologies didn't rewrite the past. They didn't give me back the years I had lost. But they did confirm one thing I hadn't imagined: the theft. Everyone had seen it. They just hadn't had the courage to name it until now. Investors tried to reach out too, offering me seats on advisory boards, dangling lucrative contracts. One even suggested I leverage the scandal into a book deal, a speaking tour, a brand. But I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol for their benefit. My fight had never been about fame. It was about agency, about finally owning what was mine. So I said no, politely, firmly. No to the interviews, no to the corporate offers, no to turning my scars into someone else's marketing campaign. Instead, I took my settlement quietly. $95 million. A number that still felt unreal when I saw it printed on the wire transfer slip. I didn't spend it on mansions or yachts. I didn't need to. Money wasn't freedom. Ownership was. And I had that now irrevocably. I used part of it to clear debts, to help my sister pay off her mortgage, to put away a trust fund for my niece's education. And then I bought something simple, a small, weathered house on the coast with white shutters and a porch that faced the sea. The first morning, I woke there, the sound of waves breaking against the rocks, the air smelling of salt and pine. I realized I could breathe in a way I hadn't in years. No deadlines, no boardrooms, no Richard Hale looming over my shoulder, ready to steal what I had built. Just me, the ocean, and the quiet hum of a laptop waiting on the kitchen table. Recognition didn't have to come with applause. Sometimes recognition was simply knowing that you had stood your ground, that the world had tried to erase you and failed. The scandal didn't fade quickly. For weeks, every business journal and news outlet picked apart HaleTech's downfall. Analysts dissected the trial transcripts, investors speculated about bankruptcy filings, and journalists ran exposés on Richard Hale's pattern of silencing female engineers. His name, once synonymous with innovation, had become shorthand for arrogance and theft. But what struck me most wasn't the headlines. It was the email. It arrived late one night, long after I had left the noise of the city for the rhythm of the sea. The subject line was simple regret. I almost deleted it unread, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, Richard's words stumbled across the screen, stripped of the polish he had always wrapped himself in. Catherine, I regret underestimating you. I regret taking what wasn't mine. I regret thinking you'd stay silent. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I see it now. I see you. I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the delete key. For 20 years, I had wanted him to say those words, to acknowledge what I had given, what he had stolen. Now, when it no longer mattered, when his empire lay in ruins, he finally offered them. But regret is cheap currency when it comes too late. I closed the email, hit delete, and felt nothing but the quiet certainty that I had already moved on. Richard's life unraveled quickly. He was forced out of HaleTech entirely, his reputation in tatters. Investors sued, employees left in droves. His family name, once gilded, became a cautionary tale whispered at conferences, "Don't pull a Hale." And me, I wasn't chasing conferences anymore. I wasn't looking for stages or applause. I poured myself into smaller, steadier things. I used part of the settlement to open a modest coding workshop in town, teaching children and teenagers how to think in algorithms the way I once had. I started an online mentorship program for women in STEM, free of charge, meeting them through a simple webcam in my sunlit kitchen. The first time, a 15-year-old girl logged in, her eyes bright with curiosity, asking me how to build her first program. I felt a surge of pride, sharper than any applause I had ever received at HaleTech. This was recognition too, not the loud public kind, but the kind that mattered, that planted roots in the future. In the evenings, I sat on my porch with a mug of tea, watching the tide roll in. I thought about all I had lost in those 20 years. Birthdays, missed holidays, sacrificed years I would never get back. But I also thought about what I had gained: clarity, freedom, and finally, control over my own name. Richard's regret belonged to him. My peace belonged to me. The mornings by the coast became my sanctuary. I would wake to the muted crash of waves against the rocks, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, and the kettle whistling softly in the kitchen. There was no rush anymore, no 6 a.m. sprint to beat traffic, no endless calendar alerts pinging my phone, just the quiet rhythm of life I had denied myself for 20 years. I set up my workspace at the small wooden table by the window. My laptop sat open, ready for the day's session, with my students, young women from across the country, who logged in to learn coding from me. Some connected from bustling cities, others from small towns where opportunities were scarce. Their faces filled my screen, eager and unguarded, and I saw in them the version of myself I once had, been hopeful, determined, and hungry to prove the world wrong. I didn't charge them. I didn't need to. The settlement money was more than enough to sustain me. What I wanted was to give them what I had been denied, a voice, a chance, and the knowledge that they didn't have to fight in silence the way I had. One afternoon, a student named Leah stayed behind after class. She was 16, her voice trembling as she said, "Ms. Monroe, I didn't think people like me could do this, but you make me believe I can." Her words lingered with me long after the call ended. That was worth more than stock options, more than applause, more than any hollow praise Richard had stolen for himself. In the evenings, I walked the shoreline, the salt air cool against my face. Sometimes I thought about Richard, what he had lost, what he had destroyed with his arrogance. I wondered if he still believed, deep down, that erasing me would have made his empire stronger. But the thought never lingered. His regret was his burden. My peace was mine. I had built a life out of code and sacrifice, and when they tried to erase me, I had answered with law, with preparation, with truth. But in the end, my victory wasn't the money or the court ruling. It was this, the freedom to decide how I lived, the chance to reclaim the years they tried to steal, the ability to wake each day and know my name was my own. On my porch, as the sun sank low and painted the water in streaks of gold, I whispered the words aloud, almost to test them. They tried to erase me. They failed. And I smiled. Not the tight, weary smile I used to wear in boardrooms, but a real one, soft and unhurried, because I knew now that silence wasn't weakness, it was power, and peace wasn't surrender, it was freedom. If anyone asked me what justice looked like, I'd tell them it wasn't the gavel strike or the settlement figure. Justice was this: a quiet house by the sea, a table full of eager students, and the knowledge that I had turned betrayal into strength. So here I am, Catherine Monroe, 45 years old, finally free. They tried to erase me, but instead, they carved my story into stone. And maybe that's all the recognition I ever needed.